Our next session celebrates the Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance. For the last 5 years, there's been an extraordinary example of hands across the Atlantic Ocean as Canada, the European Union, and the United States have cooperated in the Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance. Ireland is a big player in this because of our Atlantic position and because of our massive territory, which is under the sea. So it makes sense that this alliance was formalised here in Galway with the Canada-EU-USA Galway Statement of 2013. So to discuss how it came about and to celebrate what it's achieved so far, we're going to talk to some of the people who were directly involved in setting it up.
Máire, can I start with you and ask, what is the Galway Statement and how did it come about? Because you were central to it.
Well, it came about because we were in Boston, John Bell and myself. John worked with me, was my boss really in a way in the commission. But we were working together and we were in Boston and we ran into Peter Heffernan in Boston. And as you do when you're in Boston, you go to Harvard and you go to Harvard Square and you have a coffee. And we sat down sitting around the table, and both John Bell and Peter Heffernan are infectious, enthusiastic, absolutely determined, both of them. And they started tossing around ideas about where we needed to do different elements of research and what we should be investing in. And because we were in the United States, they felt that it was important to see if we could harness, particularly from Peter's point of view, what was happening in the oceans, or in fact what we didn't know what was happening. Like David Attenborough said, we knew more about what was happening on the moon or on Mars than we did about what was happening deeply in the ocean. And at that time, the European Union was spending, I suppose, around about $2 billion in the whole area of ocean research, marine and maritime research, sort of isolated in a way from what was happening in the Canadian government and the United States government. And we felt that if we could convince the Americans and the Canadians that it would be a good idea to set up a research alliance across the ocean and work together, that we could support each other, that we could offer opportunities to researchers to be mobile, that we could use each other's infrastructures, so whether it's buoys in the ocean or whether it's vessels that go down deep into the ocean, that we could harness all of that work that was being done separately, put it all together and work forward. And it was all about what we heard in all those videos was sustainable development of the ocean. So an awful lot has happened, and I'm not going to talk about what has happened, but the mapping of the seabed obviously is what most of us as ordinary people would hear about and know about. It was a fantastic initiative. Everything came together, Olivia, because Ireland had the presidency of the European Union at the time. So Enda Kenny believed in it, and he was from the west of Ireland on the edge of the Atlantic himself. Then we had Simon Coveney, who was a sailor, who knew and was the minister responsible and knew exactly what should be done and what could be done. And I sat beside the commissioner for the marine at the commission meetings, Maria Damanaki from Greece. And so we worked together, the whole lot of us, and came up with AORA.
And Peter, nothing like this, I mean, there may have been a lot of luck going on, but nothing like this happens by chance. So what was the lead up in the undergrowth that we don't know about?
Well, it was just one of those amazing alignment of stars. The political stars were all aligned. And I suppose John and I would have had to be awful idiots not to recognise that and not take advantage of it, but show people an opportunity that was really wholeheartedly grasped. And we do have to pay due credit to the Irish presidency and the Irish diplomacy in 2013 when we had the privilege of being presidents of the EU. And I do recall a phone call from a certain Brussels office after a trip to Washington. And there are times when Brussels speak and Washington speak aren't necessarily on the same planet. And Ireland got the opportunity to be an ambassador. And it was very, very easy for us to identify the core elements of what was at the heart of the agreement and to talk to our American colleagues, especially when their names were Kelly and Kelly and more. And just shine a light on it and say, well, perhaps we could look at it and maybe you could put the words around those 5 or 4 areas. And lo and behold, the rest is history.
Well, Craig, I mean, your great poet Walt Whitman's wonderful poem of the Song of the Sea and Ships has a wonderful line, which I probably totally misquote, about how the sea joins all peoples and all nations. And I must say I've always thought of it like that. But when it comes to scientists and researchers and agencies, and maybe when the military is involved as well, can't there be a bit of reluctance actually to share research?
I think among scientists, we find the most effective diplomats that we have across nations. And I think that the troublesome side is where we might have national barriers. But what thrills me about this alliance is everyone seated on this podium, we have such a bound relationship with a common objective, government to government, in addition to the collaboration of the scientists. If you look at the projects that we're undertaking right now, they are trilateral. They are European, they are Canadian, they are American. And the scientists always knew who their respected colleagues were and are in order to get the best of the best and work with them. And we've, I think, really broken the code of how to get the sponsoring government agencies to work together in order to enable those scientific collaborations. So while there might be stray data points of a scientist here or there that doesn't want to share what they're working on, I think the best of the science community really enjoys collegial engagement, collaboration, and we've found a way to do that government to government with the very special people I have the privilege of working with here. And I'll just put one point on it. Establishing that relationship at this level is what I think really makes this relationship work.
Yeah,
it's people.
And I mean, I've seen the rapport between yourself and Peter at various conferences here, where you were just so terrifically evangelical about the ocean and about the need to engage us all in the ocean. But are you confident that that balanced relationship is going to continue in the present political situation in the US?
Yeah, I think any political situation is just that. It's a political situation, not to be compared to the scientific appetite for collaboration.
I see what you mean about scientists being diplomats, yes.
Well, if we look at the high and low tide of funding or stated priorities across various administrations, there have been times where the United States has been higher in its appetite for certain scientific undertakings. There have been times where Canada has been lower, and I think the emergence of the EU in a very responsible period of time when it was the most difficult economic time to be moving forward with an initiative like the Galway Statement. We're going to have various tidal phases, and one thing that we discuss richly across each of these three government bodies is that if it's someone else's time to be more heavily invested or to have an opportunity to be more of a leader, that's fine, but we all get there together. And I think the bind that we have, or the bounding that we have, not the bind, sorry, but the bounding that we have is that we realize it may be someone else's turn to do one thing or the other. And even though we may not have a stated preference towards certain priorities on our federal budget, and move those priorities off to other areas, we still in the United States are proud to be joining our colleagues, but we pay for about half of the world's global ocean observing system, and we are currently resourced to continue doing that. There are many other aspects, tsunami warnings and the like, that are still in our ability to reach and perform.
Very elegantly sidestepped, and I'm going to move on to Wayne Moore, just to ask Wayne, looking at it from Canada, the sort of challenges that the Atlantic Ocean represents, and the extent to which the Atlantic Ocean Research Project can answer some of those challenges.
So thank you. Excellent question. A number of these were touched on, I think, already this afternoon. Primary among these challenges is climate change, looking at it from a point of view of both understanding the various impacts, whether it's acidification, whether it's lack of oxygen, hypoxia, but also looking at the broader linkages of those changes into communities and into industries around the Atlantic Ocean. So I think that's a key critical area, and it's not just about the mitigation, as important as that is, but also helping communities understand and adapt to these changes that we're experiencing as we go along. Plastics was another one that was mentioned, which is clearly a fundamental challenge that we're understanding the effects both at the individual level, at population levels, and at ecosystem levels. one that strikes me as particularly important as well is the issue around engaging the people around the basin in the Atlantic Ocean. So someone mentioned this morning this great Irish campaign about looking out at the ocean rather than in from the ocean. And the more that we can contribute to that debate and that activity of turning people towards the ocean, I think is something, a key challenge to helping enrich the level of public debate.
Yeah.
Lastly, again, this morning we were talking about Brexit, and one of the key things that people said were, and I think they're still around the room, fact sheets on Brexit and what this means. What are our fact sheets going forward on the North Atlantic Ocean? How can we align our scientific efforts together to make sure that we've got the right information that supports decisions, whether it's on spatial planning, whether it's on mitigation and adaptation strategies? That's a role where I think scientists, and I'm fully behind Craig in that, when they get together in a shared space, that's when they release their best energy. And I think research alliances like that allow us to do more of that.
But I suppose it must also be difficult for you that sometimes the public isn't listening, and yet you can get an event like that whale that was washed up, the enormous fish washed up recently somewhere in the north of Europe, wasn't it? And it was shown all its insides were destroyed with plastic. And that few shots on television and the papers and whatever did catch people's imagination. And you did begin to get people talking about, reusable cups. And I think you got McDonald's, if I'm right, deciding that they wouldn't use any more plastic straws. And, there were quite a number of responses to the shock of that particular picture. But you as scientists would have known this was happening all along. Do you despair sometimes that it needs a really graphic incident like that to make the public aware of what it is we're challenged by?
I fully fall into the prisoner of hope camp.
Yeah.
It's something that I think, it's certainly difficult, but I think whether there are very positive moments, such as the moment the Irish presidency, or whether there's some of the more negative moments. I mean, we had a very challenging summer last year in the North Atlantic in Canada and the US with regard to North Atlantic right whales. But using these opportunities, whether positive and, unfortunately sometimes they're negative, to move things an inch along, because I think it's really, as we discussed earlier around climate change, it's not the big solution. It's the every inch that you can take as you go along solution. And I think as long as we're still moving the dial, that's what nourishes us prisoners of hope.
Of hope. John, 5 years now of cooperation between the USA, Canada, and the EU. What do you think it's achieved?
I think at the beginning it's completely changed the political weather around oceans and research and science at a time when it wasn't popular nor profitable, as we say in Dublin. 6 or 7 years ago, people weren't thinking about oceans or plastics or reframing how oceans will determine our fate as a planet and as people. And I think the first thing it did is it mobilized people like Craig and Peter and Trevor Swordfigger's not here, and our colleagues in the scientific community. Science operates in the future tense, and they see what's coming, and it allowed us to convene around this. As you said, Wayne, you're looking out over the ocean. It's too big for any of us to own or to regulate or to do on our own. And scientists, by definition, are the most globalized, open people who are out there. So what it allowed us to do, number one, was to mobilize people who actually understood what the issues were. It has allowed us, I think, under the leadership of the European Union and Canada and the United States, to actually align the resources and actually to step up the resources based on the plan that the scientists have come together on, saying these are the 5 big ticket things that we should be doing. And as a result, 5 years on, we have people talking in this way right across the Atlantic, not just in the North Atlantic now, but we have Brazil and South Africa and Argentina and other African countries following this model. We have similar partnerships in the Black Sea, in the Mediterranean, and the Baltic, so there's been a lesson on how to actually do this. We have 500 research teams now there and they're not waiting for orders. What is the next mission going to be? And I think the other thing it has done, it has put the oceans, which were they were a thing for marine biologists. Yeah. Now they're things for citizens and politicians and mayors and so forth. So it's put the oceans, it's a bit like the photograph from the Apollo in political terms. It's actually reframed how we see ourselves in relation to the world. It's the beginning of what we call the Blue Enlightenment, a repositioning of how we understand ourselves in terms of this world that we're on. So I think that, and the fact that it's now seeping into practical actions. What can we do about it? It's given momentum because of not just the friendships and the alliances and the science plans and the financial mobilization. It's now turning into action. So people have started to believe you can actually get things done if you organize, you cooperate. And you'll see now whether it's funding, the European Union's funding, we've committed to 250 million euros a year as a minimum. And we've a new framework program coming out next year where we may even have a big mission for the oceans to work around the world to clean them of plastics by 2027 and to use science and research to convene different people and bring it together. So it's been both in political, in operational, in scientific, and I think in public terms, it's a reason why we have optimists, because optimists in the end win.
Well, Máire, in a way, isn't that one of the terrific things about it? I mean, to hear John there talking about a commitment, or at least an attempt, to clean the ocean of plastic by 2027, did you say? I mean, wow.
Yeah.
It's ambitious.
It is ambitious, but I think you have to be in this business, in the business of research and science, you have to be ambitious. And there's a tendency sometimes in government, well, I suppose there's a tendency always in government that you want to be able to say when the election comes that, you know, we've invested X million euro in a particular area and these are the jobs that were created and this is the result of what we did. When you're talking about research and science, you can't say that because you don't get results that quickly. But what you do get is what IORA has delivered, which is researchers working together. And all of my fellow speakers here who spoke said researchers work together. They love working together. They were not as good, I remember when I became a commissioner, at telling the public what they were doing and explaining it. You know, they talked in scientific terms. And it was a challenge for me at the time when I spoke to scientists to say, you know, you need to tell the public. I have to tell the public. We have to explain why we think as a commission that investing in research and science is really fundamentally important.
Narrative. Yeah.
And yes, and also that to those governments who have reduced funding in research and science, and some of them have, that you will never be able to take back the years that you have lost.
Yeah. Isn't this true, Peter, that, I mean, you are an evangelist anyway, I don't have to ask whether you are, but that scientists have to take on that role?
Absolutely, but to put it in context, the lady to my right doubled Europe's science budget during Europe's worst fiscal crisis.
Yeah.
Think about that.
Yeah.
That's ambition. So a mission ocean is not beyond us. And I can remember scientists questioning whether she could deliver. This was delivery. The delivery and the ambition and the commitment to the whole alliance, it's all based on trust. It's all based on open data. It's all based on scientists from each jurisdiction defining the priorities and defining how to solve it. And open data gives trust to everyone. It takes the threat out of it, or the risk out of it, and it empowers everything.
So Wayne, and I'm going to ask Craig the same question. We've heard about an ambitious plan to clear the ocean of plastic by 2027. That seems to me almost enough to be going on with. But what else, you know, has this Atlantic Ocean Alliance? What else has it got in mind? What's next?
So I think in terms of what's next, there's such a wide range of challenges. I think one of the things that I think we need to continue to look at is making sure that we're aligning efforts when we bring to these three parties around the table are not the only ones doing ocean science in this world. I think we're three parties making important contributions, and we're tied in individually to so many networks. So the G7 blueprint out of Charlevoix on healthy oceans and coastal communities, the Commonwealth Head of Government meeting where they just came out with a blue charter, that work, how we tie that work together and create a better alignment to make sure that our scientific resources are well utilized going forward, because there are far too many problems to have duplication, to have not sharing data. So I think going forward, creating that alignment, open data, as was just mentioned, is such an important area, and I think that's an area we need to look at moving further and faster so we can more broadly tell our story and more broadly engage people. And again, I think looking at climate vulnerability, I think it continues to be such a challenging and important area that it's going to take a lot of heads to work together to crack that nut.
Okay, and Craig, from your point of view in the US, what's next for
Well,
the Atlantic Research Alliance?
I like where Wayne was in terms of concluding with climate, because our understanding of the oceans, the physical chemical processes, the more we know about the ocean, the more we can be predicting what our future is going to be. The climate drivers are exceptionally important, and we're working on those principally through an observing network, because we need to be observing and measuring the ocean. That's one of the major ambitions that we have with AORA, with the Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance. Mapping the Atlantic, it's just absolutely bizarre to think that we don't have a map of the Atlantic after so many military engagements have taken place and transported machines, people, goods, equipment over this ocean. So let me take a twist. We've got 5 major areas that we're working in right now. Those 5 came bottom up. Those 5 were defined by the science community and the ocean managers for the information and data that they needed. One most recently delivered was to assess the potential to engage in ecosystem-based management, not subject by subject, but to look at the entire marine ecosystem. And that was generated by our scientists. We richly embraced it, we understood its importance, and we just turned it on, and that team is doing marvelous work already. But I'd like to also answer this question in terms of what have we spawned because of the Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance and because of these 3 countries working together. Not just map the North Atlantic, but now there's something called Seabed 2030, which has an ambition to map the entire world's ocean by the year 2030. And what was, I forget, I'm sorry, which of the lads mentioned it, but some of the other satellite alignments that are popping up around the world, that's a basis of collaboration that's defined under a UN body, the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. Peter and I each represent our Peter for Ireland, vice the EU, myself for the United States. There are 149 countries in this international body. That body has been inspired by what is going on in the North Atlantic. We did that rather than the global body reaching down saying, gosh, why don't you countries get a little better organized regionally? We've done it, we've shown how to do it, and it's working marvelously. So mapping the ocean, ecosystem management, we're engaged in aquaculture refinement, because where there's a market propensity to buy or not buy cultured fish as opposed to wild caught fish, the European market response is the same as the North American market response. And if we solve that education gap better, we'll be able to enhance those markets better. But speaking of education, ocean literacy, allowing the public to understand better. If the scientists can, let them tell the story. If there are other tools to convey to the public the importance of ocean science and how the ocean drives our life on Earth, let those spokespersons, maybe it's Blue Ocean Part 2, it's all of these tools.
A last word to you, Peter, because I know how passionate you are about the whole project of mapping the Atlantic. So tell us how much the Atlantic Research Alliance has helped you to further that ambition.
Well, Ireland has made an international commitment at the Malta conference last year to invest $1 million's worth of ship time from the Celtic Explorer to map the Atlantic Ocean. And in May to early June this year, on a project at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, we created a living map. An area the size of County Clare was mapped within that survey, and also all the biological and information about the living resource was created. And I think, on top of what everybody has said about mapping, observing, predicting, I think there's a wonderful opportunity to federate this initiative, this last frontier to be discovered, to include the private sector in a way that has never happened before. And I think the private sector is ready for that across a range of investments, from pure philanthropy right through return on investment, and a technological revolution in how to map will follow.
Well, we're going to be celebrating this particular 5-year-long alliance at a special event this evening. It starts at 7 o'clock here in this hall. It's going to include the most wonderful smorgasbord of seafood, and it's going to include music and poetry, I'm told. So be here if you want to celebrate that. And right now, it's coffee time, but be back here at 5 for our next session, if you please. And thank you to our panel.